Nearly 5 years after ISIL declared a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, the militant group is on the brink of defeat in eastern Syria. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Syrian Democratic Forces and the U.S.-led coalition say it's only a matter of time before ISIL is defeated in Syria. Some 300 militants are reportedly hiding out in underground tunnels and caves in Baghuz in eastern Syria. It's considered the last ISIL stronghold. A convoy of trucks was sent into the village on Tuesday to evacuate civilians. The United Nations reporting that militants are holding as many as 200 families hostage, but a spokesman for the SDF says some of the fighters and civilians have now surrendered.
Our current military strategy is to evacuate civilians. Yes, they are the relatives, the families of the militants, but nevertheless, we consider them civilians. They are women and children.
For more on the fate of ISIL and Syria's future, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from London is Kamal Alam. He's a visiting fellow with the Royal United Services Institute. From Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer. He is a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. Here with us in the studios, Emma Ashford. She's a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute here in Washington, D.C. And from Istanbul, Metin Gurcan is a security analyst and columnist for Al-Monitor's Turkey Pulse. Kamal, let's start with you, if you don't mind. Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces targeting this ISIL stronghold. You heard what the United Nations is saying about this. It sounds rather dire. Give me your sense about this last push.
Yes, I think there's a lot of focus on the last stand in ISIS as far as the coalition goes. And, of course, the humanitarian conditions are always grave on the ground in this war. There have been loads of incidents in the north and east of Syria where, as the coalition or the Russian forces go in, it makes it harder for the civilians. But as far as ISIL goes, I think tactically their days are over. They will have very little space left to operate in Syria. It's what follows afterwards that's important. I think it's a tussle between the Syrian government, the Kurdish forces, and on what the coalition wants that will decide how ISIL pans out in the future. As a tactical force, they have very little power left. But in the vacuum that might be left and a tussle between the Turkish forces, the Syrian government forces, and its Russian allies, that's what will decide what happens afterwards.
Let's talk about the people who fled, about 30,000 ending up in refugee camps. When they return, what are they going to return to? I mean, all these areas, we look at it, it looks like a ghost town, bombed out structures. I mean, what's the future hold for them?
Yes, I think that's still very early days to see what the future holds from them. As Syria recovers very slowly and moves into stabilization, reconstruction is still very slow. We've seen, at least in the south, from the Jordan border, thousands of Syrian refugees are coming back every week, and the Syrian government's trying its best to look after them. In the areas in the north, especially if you still look at the former capital, Raqqa, it's completely devastated. So where there are the SDF forces and Syrian Kurdish forces, there's been very little reconstruction and very little hope for the refugees returning home. In the south and in areas where the Syrian government is, it's a different situation. Despite all the problems, the Syrian government is looking after the refugees coming home. But where you have SDF forces, there's very little to show because there's a battle between the SDF and other forces in Idlib or other parts where the Turkish forces back the FSA.
So, Emma, there's so many moving parts with Syria, as you well know. You've covered this for a while. One of the interesting features, though, back in December, the U.S. president on this phone call with Erdogan saying, look, we're done. We're pulling all 2,000 out. Give me your sense. Is ISIL defeated? Is the mission accomplished?
You know, I think, as my colleague pointed out, ISIL is tactically defeated. The group has been defeated in battle, or will be within days if it hasn't. The question of what happens to the group afterwards, however, is a much trickier one. And that's why in U.S. policy we have seen such a strange power struggle between President Trump, on the one hand, saying we'll be pulling out, we'll be pulling all our troops out, we'll be pulling them out within 30 days, and then people in the Pentagon or in Congress saying, well, we need to ensure a longer transition so ISIL doesn't resurge. U.S. allies stepping up and saying the same, that they don't want a quick U.S. withdrawal. And it's really all very confused, I think, just because nobody's answering that question of what do you do to stop ISIS coming back?
And to that question, I mean, is this deja vu all over again? I mean, I look back at 2011, I found the quote from Barack Obama. Of course, we're talking about Iraq. He declared that the U.S. military was leaving Iraq. He said the forces were leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq. Of course, there was a vacuum there. ISIL filled it. Is the U.S. falling back into that same trap? I mean, what happens when they leave?
You know, I think the problem is not U.S. withdrawal. I think the U.S. has done its job in Syria and it should be getting out soon. I think the problem is that we have not been sufficiently attentive to the diplomatic questions. What groups control what parts of Syria, particularly northeastern Syria, in our absence? How do we ensure that groups like the Kurds aren't massacred or just overrun by Turkey? And how do we ensure that there's some sort of stable peace? Because as in Iraq, if there is not a stable peace, there is room for groups like ISIS to grow and seize territory.
Lots of questions to get answered. We still don't have any answers to those questions. Pavel, let me turn to you. Of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Turkish President Erdogan, and Hassan Rouhani from Iran meeting in Sochi last week, talking about a post-war Syria. Let's listen to what Putin had to say.
During the talks, the parties discussed the impact of the announced plans of the United States to withdraw American troops from the northeastern regions of the country. According to us, that would be a positive step that would help stabilize the situation in this region of Syria, where ultimately the legitimate government should reestablish control.
Pavel, you heard Emma say that this poses a lot of questions for analysts, but Russia, of course, embracing this. Why do they see this as a positive move?
Well, the Americans were seen as the main enemies by the Russians, by the Iranians, by the Syrian regime, and actually Turkey also didn't like American alliance with the Kurdish Democratic Forces. And so when the Americans out, this unifying factor sort of disappears. Everyone, of course, says good riddance. But now there's a problem of how to divide Syria up so as to still try to keep this alliance of Turkey, Russia, and Syria and Iran still viable. Because all these parties have somewhat different agendas in Syria, and something they agree and something not. And Moscow is trying to kind of find the middle ground to keep the Damascus happy, keep the Kurds not wiped out by the Turks, and keep the Turks also happy. And also there's, of course, the problem of Idlib province, where Russia and Iran and the Damascus regime want to run a kind of cleansing operation. So there's a lot of problems left with the Americans out, and with actually ISIS more or less as a fighting force also down. And they were also a unifying factor. Everyone hated ISIS. They were everybody's enemies.
Well, you're talking about a lot of issues there for Russia to deal with. What's Russia's role moving forward then?
Well, Russia has a clear objective in Syria. It's keeping Russian bases, the naval base that we had before, but now it's expanded, and also the air base to provide our permanent naval presence in the Mediterranean with air cover. And for that, we need a stable Syrian regime. We need the Bashar al-Assad regime in place and more or less stable. So that's what Russia wants. And that's very important for the Assad regime to take over control of the areas of Dar al-Zor, in particular province, that are right now under Kurdish American kind of protection, where there are the main natural gas and oil deposits. If this comes over under Syrian government control, they'll have an independent source of income, and that's very important for stabilizing the regime. At the same time, it's kind of finding some kind of way to accommodate Turkish security interests, and also important for Moscow, as to put as much wedges as possible between Washington and Ankara. That's also a very important strategic objective.
Well, let's talk about Ankara. Metin, of course, Erdogan wants this buffer zone. It seems like Iran and Russia in opposition to that. What's the objective for Erdogan? Where does he see things going?
Sir, before talking about the objectives of our President Erdogan, let me turn back to your initial question, whether or not ISIS has been defeated. It's an important point I think we should concentrate on. I mean, in military terms and in terms of territorial control, yes, it has been defeated. But the ideological side of the story is extremely important, I think. I served in Afghanistan in 2005 and multiple times in Iraq. So I think the hardest part has just started, which is the post-conflict reconstruction. And then in this, hardest process, we have three tracks. The first track is the material construction, reconstruction. The second one is the mental, side of the story, and the last one is the political side of the story. So a military victory is an important point, but how to translate all these military achievements into an sort of sustainable political process. This is the key issue still lingering, in Iraq and also in Syria, and how to alienate those, how to reintegrate those alienated Sunni structures into the existing political systems in Iraq and in Syria. And coming back to your question, I mean, Turkey's prime concern, Ankara's prime concern in the post-ISIS setting is diminishing the military capacity of YPG, PKK-affiliated, Kurdish armed groups controlling the northeast of Syria. And then particularly Ankara's key concern, the primary concern is to cut the military cooperation between Americans and YPG at the moment. So that's why this issue of creation of a buffer zone and then controlling the buffer borderline in the east of Europe is Ankara's primary concern.
Emma, Metin brings up a lot of interesting points about what does Syria look like after all of this is over. The guns are laid down. We know the civil war in neighboring Lebanon went on for 15 years. The World Bank rates political stability of countries. Lebanon always, even now, ranked very low in terms of political stability. There's still so many issues within that country. Translate that to Syria. I mean, what does Syria look like post-war?
Well, so there is a little bit of good news. It's bad news, but also good news. So the political science literature actually shows that countries that have a civil war and it ends in a negotiated settlement between a bunch of different groups, like Lebanon, tend to be pretty unstable afterwards. It shows also that countries where there's a civil war and one group, in this case the government, triumphs, actually tend to be more stable. So bad news for Syria today, but may actually imply that because the Assad regime controls so much of the country, things might be a little more stable going forward. The key question, I think, with reconstruction and redevelopment, however, is who's going to pay for it? Russia has already indicated that despite its support for the Assad regime, it's really not willing to pay for much reconstruction. The US certainly isn't willing to pay. The Europeans aren't really willing to pay so long as it's with the Assad regime. And so there are no really outside patrons willing to help pay for this reconstruction. The Syrian government is very much on its own. That could be a recipe for instability.
That certainly sounds like when Kamal, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, issuing a warning to the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic fighters during a speech in Damascus. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We say to those groups who bet on the Americans will not protect you. The Americans will use you as bartering tools, and they've already started doing it. If you do not prepare yourselves to defend your country and resist, you will be but slaves of Ottomans. You will be protected only by your government and the Syrian army.
So, Kamal, what's his plan for these Kurdish fighters?
I think, yes, President Assad makes a valid point there. I mean, throughout the war, he's reached out to many groups and said, look, you either work with the state or either we will fight you because your allies will abandon you. And over the last 3-4 years, that's been quite prophetic and turned out true. The rebels were abandoned in various parts of Syria, one after the other, in the south in Jordan and also in the northeast and northwest. He's saying same to the Syrian Kurds, whether it's the SDF or even the YPG. They've had a cold peace between them, i.e. they've turned their guns on each other a few times, but the Kurds need Damascus more than Damascus needs them, because the SDF have realized that they will be thrown under the bus at some point, if not now, in a few months or in a year at most. So they will need to negotiate with the Syrian government. If you look at what happens in Qamishli and Hasakeh, you have Syrian government forces side by side with various Syrian Kurdish groups. So ultimately, they will negotiate with Damascus, and they realize that they cannot gain full autonomy without working with Damascus. And the Syrian government I think they realize as well that realistically they will have to give up some self-autonomy to Kurdish groups, however, not at the expense of Syrian government forces leaving. So what that means is the president is saying to them, we will come back in the areas and we will police the areas. No one will be there to help you but us. So rather than work with the others, work with us. And over the last month, we've seen a lot of negotiations between the Syrian army and intelligence and the Syrian Kurdish forces. So it's a matter of time once the SDF or other Kurdish groups in the north work with the Syrian government.
And Metin, how's it being viewed there in Ankara?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, Ankara's primary concern in the post-ISIS setting is to diminish the military capacities of YPG, PKK-affiliated YPG. But I think the real question at hand is, still we are inclined to define things in the post-ISIS setting through the prism of state's interest. I think this is the issue. So I have to say that Ankara or, Tehran or the other regional players, their concerns, of course, they are very important, but the very first point that we have to concentrate is, what those decision makers in Washington, D.C. and Moscow are thinking about. I mean, this is the key question at hand. I am inclined to think that if you want to fix things in Syria, then what we need is a sort of top-down approach. So that's why first, American and Russian decision makers should sit on the negotiation table. And then also they should have a sort of coordinated and synchronized vision for Syria. And that's also they should have a clear-cut end states, particularly about defining this, Damascus relationship with the political actors representing periphery like Syrian Kurds, Sunni armed groups, opposition. And then also, this is the key issue at hand. So I think Ankara and Tehran will follow the fashion. So that's why it's high time for me to have a coordination and cooperation between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, defining the end states, particularly in Syria, and also the constitution-making process is extremely important in this work. So I think Moscow has big homework to do that, and then this is the promise that they should deliver to the people to fix things in Syria.
Pavel, what about that homework, especially when you have an administration that simply wants to wipe its hands and get out?
Oh, yes, of course, having cooperation is a great idea. Actually, Moscow and the Russian military have been, since 15, proposing some kind of cooperation to the American military, which replied that they don't have the authority to have anything but just deconfliction agreements with Russia. And sitting down and finding a joint position, well, maybe first the White House and the Pentagon and the State Department in Washington should sit down and have a united position on what's the future of Syria, because I don't see them having such a position at all. I mean, you can't negotiate with Washington if Washington doesn't really decide itself what it wants to do further. And of course, there's also a very important issue that has not been mentioned. It's the kind of the elephant in the room. That's the Israeli-Iranian standoff that may actually explode this entire situation inside Syria into a new big war. Because after ISIS is gone, right now, that's the main problem. And that's the coming threat.
Emma, let's talk about two of the things you brought up. One, agreement in the United States. I mean, we've heard so many say this is going to be a bloodbath. The Kurdish fighters who've been on our side, they're going to die. A lot of people in opposition to what the Trump administration's done. I mean, we even saw this conflict with an ally of Trump, Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, kind of teeing off on the defense secretary, the acting defense secretary. Talk to us about that element of it, and then the other thing that Pavel brought up, which, of course, Israeli-Iranian tensions.
I think it's very easy to blame sort of the dysfunction in the U.S. government on Donald Trump just because he's tweeting about withdrawing from Syria. He never seems to know what he wants. He changes his mind all the time. But actually, if you go back 3-4 years, there has never been a lot of agreement inside the U.S. government on what to do about Syria. Even the Obama administration was very conflicted, said they had red lines, said they wouldn't intervene, then actually did intervene by arming a bunch of groups and funding a bunch of groups. Then they intervened against ISIS. So there has never been a consensus in Washington on what to do other than fighting ISIS. Now that ISIS is gone, the fact that there is no consensus has become much clearer. And so I do agree with Pavel on this. Before any negotiations between the US and Russia, Syria, Iran, anyone else, the US would need to have a much more consistent position. And then the second issue that he raises, the Israeli-Iranian issue, complicates this further, because if there is one position that the Trump administration has been very clear on in recent years, it is its unqualified support for the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu and its opposition to the Iranian government. So in fact, some of these sort of internal debates over Syria right now with the US government are actually from anti-Iran hawks trying to say, well, we need to leave US presence in Syria in order to watch Iran and sort of help Israel with this process. So there's just no agreement on these things, but it does seem like it could head in a very dangerous direction.
Yeah, and it seems like it just gets more and more complicated as we kind of walk down this road. Pavel, back to you. The Russian Defense Ministry now saying it's going to open up 2 humanitarian corridors in Syria to get to these people in the Rukban refugee camp and allow them to return home. We're talking about 60,000 refugees. This is an area that borders Syria, Jordan, Iraq. These people have been there for years. 8 children died back in December because they couldn't get medicine and food to them. Talk to us about the difficulty of that for the Russian government.
Well, there have been some convoys reaching that area. The Humanitarian UN and the Russian military said that they helped those convoys get in. Again, the main Russian problem there is the problem of American military presence. And that this area has been designated by the Americans as a basically no-fly, no-entry zone for Russian or Syria, pro-Damascus forces or Iranian-leaning forces. But of course, the Americans say that they're going to leave. They're, of course, not only American, there were British, there were actually Norwegian special forces there in that area. There, right now, most likely the whole coalition is going out. And then the Syrian pro-Iranian forces go in, and then they'll kind of most likely deal with the refugee situation. I don't think that there's going to be a lot of fighting. There are some fighters there, American trained, but not a really big force, and will not require any serious military action by pro-Damascus or any kind of other forces. But there will be a problem with refugees. But for Moscow, it's American presence, and for Iran, that's American presence in that area, and they would very much want the Americans out. When they're out, then they're going to kind of control the area, and that's would be seen as the right solution.
Want the Americans out? Emma, the American president wants the ISIL prisoners out. He wants the European Union. You take them, or we're going to just let them go. Talk to me about that, and how does that complicate things?
You know, this takes us back to all the debates that we had in Iraq, in Afghanistan, with the fight against al-Qaeda. Takes us back to the debates about Guantanamo Bay, whether we should be trying enemy combatants, leaving them in Syria to be tried. And I think that the president, at least in his appeal to European allies, is right here. In most cases, what he's talking about are citizens of these nations in Europe. And if we look at the news even over just the last couple of days, we see that countries like Britain, Germany, France, they just haven't really dealt with the problem of how they're going to handle these returning fighters and family members. The president is sort of pushing the issue, but those countries are going to have to make a decision on what they do with these fighters in the long run.
And Kamal, let's talk about that, because this is going to be a major challenge for Europe. These wives and children of ISIL fighters, of course, one coming to mind, the BBC recently interviewing this woman, Shamima Begum. She joined ISIL when she was just 15 years old. Let's listen to a little bit of this conversation.
What do you think will happen to you when you go back to the UK?
My first priority is my son, obviously, because I don't know whether he'll be taken away from me or they'll let me keep him or give him to my family while the UK decide what to do with me, you know, to put me in prison, to put me in a de-radicalization course. I don't know. I don't actually know. The problem is I don't know what my options are, what options I'll be given. So I don't want to just come back in and ask, oh, I want this and this and this, because it's not really appropriate.
Kamal, how about the British government? How are they going to handle these cases?
Well, you've probably seen that the British government announced that they're stripping her off her British citizenship in the last day. That's met with a lot of criticism here in the UK because that's seen as unconstitutional. She doesn't have another passport There's a link because of her Bangladeshi origins, but she's never been to Bangladesh or has a passport. So as things stand, the UK Home Secretary has taken her passport away. Well, that's kicked off a huge firestorm here, which leads into the other argument that what do you do with them coming back? She's not the first case, and she has rights despite her passport being taken away. There is no proper strategy in the UK or other European countries apart from, well, let's take their passports away, maybe they can go somewhere else. Well, those other countries where the origins might lie will not take them just because their parents came from there, whether it's North Africa in the case of France or South Asia in the case of most British Muslims. So that's where there is a complete black hole legally and also logistically what happens with them. And I think all of this plays into the hands of the Russians and other regional countries, because the Europeans are in a complete mess when it comes to making a decision on what happens with them. And this goes back to 5-6 years ago when all of this conflict began. Early on in the first couple of years, there were hundreds and thousands of European citizens going to fight in Syria, and nothing was done about this. And there still isn't any strategy to cope with it. The Syrian government will take advantage. The SDF will take advantage. I think Turkey might be a country that might have an answer, because Turkey has dealt with this problem. They've arrested loads of citizens, they've kept with them, or they've dealt with the refugees as well. And amongst the refugees coming to Europe, there have been a lot of terrorists that have been slipping through. So I think this is something which is a grave concern. The attacks in Belgium and France, 3 of the attackers were fighting in Syria, and all 3 were Belgian and French nationals. So this is where cooperation and coordination is needed. And at some point, they have to go back to the Syrian government and Syrian intelligence. They're the ones with the best intelligence on the ground, along with the Russians.
Metin, we'll leave the final word for you. He mentioned Turkey. Do they have a solution? I mean, they've absorbed tons of refugees. Do they want them all to return to Syria? I mean, what's the situation there?
Yeah, right now, you know, in Turkey, 3.8 million people, you know, refugees. They are trying to survive, and then they are looking for days to turn back to Syria. But the real problem at hand, you know, in contrast to Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-linked armed groups, ISIS pursued a family-centric approach when recruiting, you know, fighters and, you know, calling for its so-called jihad, you know, to, you know, invite people to Syria and Iraq. So this family-centric approach has still been a new phenomenon for us that we cannot, you know, adequately address. So that's why we have hundreds of, you know, widows, and also we have thousands of children right now. Are they terrorists, or to be sent to the prisons, or are they the victims of these, you know, painful processes and should be, you know, going through sent for, you know, reintegration and de-radicalization processes? These are very, very tough questions, and then these are hard questions. And then, unfortunately, in the international, you know, setting, you know, international norms do not provide answers for us, and particularly the legal institutions in the states. Particularly in Turkey, we don't have, you know, the answers.
Well, I want to thank our panel. You've given us a lot to think about. There are still a lot of hard questions left to be answered. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.